Today, we'll visit a small town near Moscow that became the scene of a gruesome crime. Someone brutally killed a retired woman right in her home. The perpetrator got into the apartment, raped the woman, and strangled her. Even though the murderer left many traces on the scene, including his DNA, he wasn't caught. And for 10 more years, similar murders continued. The killer didn't stop. He attacked time after time, preferring victims that lived alone, until his passion for trophies from his murder scenes finally betrayed him. But how did he get into the victims' homes, and what is it that gave away the killer who'd managed to evade justice for 10 years? There are many small towns and villages in the suburbs of Moscow. Most of them are nondescript settlements with rows of identical commie blocks next to a neighborhood of disparate single-family housing. But there is also the occasional luxury village with mansions, gardens, and pools. These are usually inhabited by affluent Muscovites who prefer to live away from the din of the city. These people usually either work remotely or commute to their office in Moscow on a daily basis. Today's story takes place in the Kashirsky district, 71 miles or 115 kilometers from Moscow. The district incorporates 97 settlements, the town of Kashir itself, as well as many smaller settlements. The inhabitants of the district are a diverse group: ordinary workers commuting daily into Moscow, rich entrepreneurs, families with children, and retirees. The housing is as varied as the population, ranging from brand new mansions to dilapidated cottages inhabited mostly by impoverished retirees. There are also the usual clusters of commie blocks where even a simple worker can afford to rent an apartment. The buildings are old, often in poor condition, boasting thin walls and cockroaches. It was in the dark alleys between these blocks that the first murder in our story was committed. For some reason, the locals hadn't installed bars on their first-floor windows, as Russians generally do to protect their homes from thieves. In February 2010, rumors started circulating in the district that someone had strangled and raped a 79-year-old woman who lived on the first floor of a residential block on Frunze Street. The only thing missing from her apartment was a cheap radio. At the crime scene, police found traces of DNA that was not in the database, meaning the perpetrator hadn't been prosecuted in similar cases before. That was all the police managed to do at the time. The woman was buried, and her killer disappeared even though the police had an important lead. It turned out that the killer had climbed into the apartment through a ventilation window. This strange manner meant that he had to be thin and quite flexible. For 3 years, nothing happened, until another crime shook the district in 2013. A 95-year-old woman, widow of a World War II veteran, was found barely alive under similar circumstances, on the first floor with an open window. The attacker had sexually assaulted the woman with a crutch in apparent rage. All that was missing from the apartment were the war medals of the deceased husband. The maniac was obviously not looking for money or valuables. He just wanted something as a trophy to remind him of what he'd done. The victim survived the attack, but died soon thereafter. Her heart gave out. Till her very last moment, the elderly woman could not believe what had happened to her. A few months later, there was an attack on a 60-year-old woman from the neighboring town of Stupino. This time, however, nothing was taken from the apartment. In March 2015, a 42-year-old ticket collector went missing. One evening, the woman was walking home slightly drunk but never showed up. Her body was later found in a shallow grave near the Tesna railway station. This crime had no similarities to the previous ones, so it too remained unsolved for a long time, as nobody thought to connect it to the murders of retired women 2 years earlier. Things were quiet for almost 5 years after that. In 2020, the killer struck again, and this time he pulled out all the stops. Apparently, he was upset at the long pause between murders, so he went for a particularly heinous crime. One night in 2020, a man broke into a 2-story house in the Kashira district, owned by a 50-year-old businessman. At the time, the house was filled with people. It was early January and numerous friends and relatives had gathered to celebrate the new year. At night, the owner of the house became anxious. He thought he'd heard the voice of his 10-year-old daughter who was sleeping alone in her room. He got up and went to her, and when he opened the door, he noticed a strange male figure fleeing through the window. The girl was unconscious and unable to speak. The attacker had raped her and broken her hyoid bone in an attempt to strangle her. The police's first suspect was the father, but the DNA evidence didn't match him or the other man who'd spent the night in the house. The police failed to catch the perpetrator while the trail was still hot. The victim, who had spent a month in the hospital, couldn't describe her attacker because the room was dark. The killer struck again in February 2020, just a month after the previous attack. This time, he attempted to strangle a sleeping 14-year-old girl who was home alone. However, the girl woke up and resisted her attacker fiercely, biting and punching him several times. The attacker, whose face the girl couldn't make out in the dark, got scared, broke the window, and ran away. The girl immediately called the police, but once again, the criminal had gotten away long before the police arrived on the scene. After 2 failed murders, the Maniac stopped killing for 4 months. On June 8, 2020, he decided to resume his attacks, sneaking into the room of an 88-year-old woman on Dzerzhinsky Street in Kashira. Evidently, he went back to elderly victims because of his previous lack of luck with children, which was why he decided to choose someone who would definitely not fight back. The next morning, the woman's social worker found her body. The killer tried to steal the TV set but ended up leaving it in the yard. But that was not all he tried to steal that day. While checking the CCTV footage near the latest crime scene, the police came across something interesting. On the night of the attack, a strange man in a denim suit had thrown something into the grass near the murdered woman's house. The police searched the spot and found the victim's savings book. That's when they realized that the man in the video was the very killer who had eluded the police for all these years. From there on, the case progressed fairly quickly. It took investigators only a day to identify the killer, since his movements were caught on surveillance tapes. On June 10th, merely 2 days after the murder, an unremarkable thin man named Andrei Yezhov was arrested next to his house. The neighbors couldn't believe that the quiet, calm Yezhov was the maniac who had been terrorizing the entire area. But that's almost always how it is. Murderers seem calm and innocuous to their neighbors, and nobody has even the faintest idea of the terrible secrets that they're hiding. So, who is Andrei Yezhov, and how did he manage to hide from justice for so many years? Andrei Yezhov was born in 1967 in the village of Sloboda in the Smolensk region to a milkmaid and a tractor driver. The family was an orderly one, and even though Yezhov's parents were simple people, they surrounded him and his brother with love and care. But it didn't help. From a young age, Andrei behaved strangely, peeping on women in the local bathhouse and even copulating with cows and other animals, including dead ones. Yezhov confessed to this during interrogation in an attempt to justify his actions. His family, of course, wasn't aware of these passions. The young Andrei indulged in zoophilia clandestinely. After 8th grade, Yezhov went to a vocational school and after graduating as a car mechanic, served in the Soviet missile forces. He then returned to his home village and got a job as a stoker on a dairy farm. After a while, Yezhov was promoted to driver. While at the farm, he began a relationship with a woman named Valentina. The couple eventually moved to the Kashira district, hoping to find better jobs in the suburbs of Moscow. The plan worked. Yezhov started working as a plumber and earning more money. He and Valentina got married. The relationship soon went sour. Yezhov cheated on Valentina with a friend of his brother's wife, who was a teacher and psychologist. Eventually, Yezhov left his wife for his mistress and had 2 children with her. Yezhov lived with his new wife for an entire 30 years, and his friends described him as an exemplary family man with children and grandchildren. Here's what a neighbor of theirs said about the Yezhov family. "I can't say anything bad. There have never been any incidents. They don't make any noise, don't cause any disturbances. They're nice, good neighbors." Although everything seemed great on the surface, the Yezhovs had problems in their sex life. By the mid-aughts, the couple had pretty much stopped making love, and Yezhov took up spying on women in bathhouses again, as well as peeking through the windows of first-floor apartments. More and more often, he would get drunk in his garage, which was also where he later hid his murder trophies. Despite sexual problems, the couple maintained a good relationship, enjoying life with their children and grandchildren. Neighbors sometimes saw Yezhov drunk, but noted that he behaved decently. After his arrest, Yezhov broke down quickly during interrogation and started confessing to his crimes. The murders were mostly unplanned, committed while he was intoxicated. At first, he would stand outside the window for a long time, trampling on the neat front gardens and making sure the victim was alone. Tenants blamed the local hooligans for trampling the flowers, completely unaware of the danger that was lurking in the dark. Whenever Yezhov realized that the victim wasn't alone, he would immediately hide. Yezhov was indeed very thin, which allowed him to climb through ventilation windows. He committed his first murder when he was drunk. He saw the victim, became aroused, and went for the kill. Yezhov didn't care how old his victims were, but he chose those who were likely to resist less, apparently understanding that otherwise he wouldn't be able to fight back. Yezhov's wife didn't know about her husband's horrific exploits, thinking that he was being called to sewage-related emergencies, because at that time he was a plumber at the Kashira Housing Maintenance Department. However, Yezhov only rarely made such emergency trips, spending most of his spare time hunting down women. Yezhov planned the attack on the 10-year-old girl in advance, having spotted her at the children's center where his wife worked. The horrified wife probably even told him about what happened to her charge, and Yezhov likely nodded in false sympathy, knowing full well who committed the terrible crime. To this day, the victim is still in psychotherapy to recover from such deep trauma. The public immediately gave Yezhov many nicknames: the Window Maniac, the Kashirsky Maniac, the Killer Plumber. His arrest was all over the news. He was unable to explain his actions. Allegedly, the desire to kill arose when Yezhov's wife did not satisfy his sexual needs. When his wife didn't turn him down, he didn't kill anyone. Here are his own words about the crimes. "I confess that I have murdered and raped numerous women over the past 10 years. I committed the crimes to satisfy my desire to kill. This desire occurred periodically, once every 6 months, sometimes once a year." The maniac remembered all his crimes in meticulous detail, even the ones committed many years ago. "The glass was broken and fixed with duct tape. I peeled off the tape and took out the glass halves. That's how I got inside. I went into the granny's room, took her by the throat, and started strangling her. After the crime, I walked down the street over to a grass patch and threw away her savings book. And then I just went home." This is how Yezhov recounted the attack on his latest victim. Interestingly, Yezhov confessed to 4 additional murders that nobody had suspected him of. The police didn't manage to connect all the cases to each other, and the killer stunned them by telling them everything of his own volition. In the end, the investigation concluded that Andrei Yezhov had murdered 7 women and attacked 2 girls, a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old. both of whom managed to survive. What struck the police as odd, however, was that Yezhov didn't commit any crimes between 2015 and 2020. Usually, serial killers don't stop, especially for such a long period of time. Is it possible that Yezhov had more victims that he didn't tell us about? We'll most likely never know the answer. Yezhov actively cooperated with the investigation, participated in crime reenactments, and recounted his atrocities in great detail. However, less than a month after his arrest, on July 6, 2020, he hanged himself in his cell at the pretrial detention center. The killer was well aware that he was facing life in prison and apparently decided to take his own life, knowing that there was nothing good for him along the way. But did he really tell the police everything? Did he confess to all his crimes? During the interrogations, the police looked into all sorts of cases, both older and newer ones, trying to find Yezhov's signature characteristics, but in vain. They only managed to connect to the case those crimes that Yezhov himself confessed to. Perhaps, someday a DNA examination will find more evidence of Yezhov's crimes, but that hasn't happened yet. Andrei Yezhov died before his trial, where he would have had to meet the victims' families, describe his crimes in public, and listen to experts detail how much he had harmed the two girls. Either he couldn't stand the burden of guilt, or he was simply a coward who decided to avoid responsibility. The authorities later investigated the pretrial jail where Yezhov was found. He killed himself at night, but the body was only found the next morning, meaning that nobody had kept an eye on him during the night hours. This tells you a lot about the quality of supervision in Russian prisons. After the capture and death of the Kashirsky Maniac, residents of the Kashira district finally got some sleep, knowing that they were safe at night. But how many more such Yezhovs that we don't yet know about are lurking in the suburbs waiting to attack? Thanks for watching and supporting my channel by liking and sharing this video. Check out my other stories on this channel. The links will be in the description. And as always, stay safe.